Okay, this is going to be our first flipped classroom. It's going to be on terrorism and the U.S. response to it. I want you to make sure you guys take good Cornell notes, and also make sure that you you if you're not too sure of something, make sure you put those questions on your Cornell so we can discuss them in class. I also want you to understand too that there's also videos too, so make sure you watch those videos and take good Cornell notes over them too. And this will be our first flipped classroom that we're going to do probably several more throughout the year. But this is going to be our first run through to see if it actually works pretty well. Okay, so let's get started. So our unit objectives are, we're going to be able to, by the end of this flipped classroom activity, this PowerPoint slide with some videos, you're going to be able to define terrorism, identify and explain the causes of terrorism, compare and contrast different terrorist groups, differentiate state-sponsored terrorism and non-state actors, explain the differences between domestic and international terrorism, and analyze the effectiveness of the U.S. response to terrorism. So what is terrorism? Terrorism is the use of violent acts to frighten the people in an area as a ways of trying to achieve a political goal. That is from Merriam-Webster.com. The definition of terrorism, according to the 18 United States Code, which is the federal law that covers terrorism and what it is, defines international terrorism and domestic terrorism for purposes of Chapter 113B of the United States Code entitled Terrorism. International terrorism means activities with the following three characteristics: involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that violate federal or state law, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States or transcend national boundaries in terms of the means by which they are accomplished, the persons they appear intended to intimidate or coerce, or the locale in which their perpetrators operate to seek asylum. What that actually means, class, is that outside the territories of our jurisdiction in the U.S., that means not only the United States borders in of itself, but also our territories, such as Puerto Rico or Guam. Okay, so domestic terrorism means activities with the following three characteristics: involve acts dangerous to human life that violate federal or state law, appear intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the U.S., which means it has to occur within the United States itself or within one of our territories, such as Puerto Rico or Guam. Also, I also want you to point out too that sometimes if you have domestic terrorists, they can or cannot be U.S. citizens. If they're here on a visa and they commit a terrorist act in the United States, that would be considered probably considered domestic terrorism, unless they have some sort of link to an international terrorist group. Okay, let's talk about domestic terrorism first. Okay, first, what is domestic terrorism? Now, we had the legal definition. Okay, it's political violence within our own borders. Okay, we seek to change or influence government policies or even to overthrow the government. It can be left wing, right wing, or religious in ideology. Now, what do I mean by ideology? Ideology is an idea, is what you think about something. Okay, what is left wing and right wing? Well, left wing would be has a communist, socialist, or Marxist ideology, which would mean that you would want more state control of the government and more state control of business and other things, and even you might even see a curtailment of civil rights. Right wing now would be the extreme conservative, very much anti-central government, anti-federal government, and also at times could also be some racist groups out there, such as neo-Nazi groups. Religious could be imposing religious values or laws onto a government, or adopt only one official religion. So it would be, you might see issues of, let's say, Islamic, radical Islamic and Islamic fundamentalism, such as ISIS or Al Qaeda. Okay, can also be state sponsored, which would mean, what does that mean by state sponsored? Well, state sponsored is um, that the state sponsors, that the government sponsors a terrorist group, whether it's an international terrorist group where they provide training for, or it is a state-sponsored terrorist group um, that is operating within uh, your own country in order to intimidate a specific group of people or people in general. For example, the Nazi Party. Um, it would be an example, and there were also right-wing, left-wing paramilitaries. Okay, the Nazi Party. When the Nazi Party came to power, class, um, you know, they still had the political. It was a political party, and they had what we call the brown shirts or the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which was considered the stormtroopers, and they would go ahead and intimidate Jews and communists and other political other members of different political parties, and they were not really necessarily connected with the government, but they had definitely had the support of the government. Okay, and right-wing, left-wing paramilitaries. Paramilitaries, they are not necessarily part of the military, but they're sort of act like they are part of the military. And you see this a lot during the 1970s and 1980s in Central America, especially with right-wing death squads in El Salvador, um, and also in other parts of the world right there, and even in Argentina under Pinochet. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the domestic U.S. terrorist groups, uh, some of the history of it that was in the United States. First, you have the Weather Underground, and that was a left-wing group, had a Marxist ideology from 1969 to 1981. They felt that peaceful protest was not working, and they really wanted to um, become more violent, if you will, in order to accomplish their goals. So, they were trying to protest the Vietnam War and try to protest and have greater social change. And so what they wound up doing is starting bombing banks and federal buildings after they were closed. But a lot of their leaders, a lot of their members went into hiding during the 1970s and or were arrested. And then you have the Symbionese Liberation Army, led by a man, by a man named DeFries, who went by the name of General Field Marshal Sinkay. And this was formed. It was led by a former African American escaped convict, but he had a lot of white upper middle class followers, and they wanted to go ahead and create homelands for minorities within the United States. And they were accused. The Symbionese Liberation Army was accused of killing an African American superintendent of schools, a man named Foster. And then, that they're also very well known for kidnapping Patty Hearst, who was an heir to the Hearst newspaper fortune, if you will. And they basically brainwashed her, and she became a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army and was involved in a bank robbery. Then you have the Black Liberation Army from the 1960s to the 1970s, and they were very much a militant group as well. They committed arson and robberies and murder, and what they really wanted was to establish an African American nation unto themselves. And if I remember right, they wanted like Louisiana and Mississippi to be a African American homeland, if you will. Next, we have the Order, also known as the Silent Brotherhood. This was a neo-Nazi movement, a right-wing movement out of the 1980s, and what they really were, not only were they against the Jews, they were also against African Americans. Um, you know, they did not last very long, but they did get into a shootout with the FBI, and the leader and one of the leader of the movement was killed, and some of his followers were arrested and were sent to prison. Next, you have the Posse Comitatus from 1969 to about the present. They're still around, but they've morphed into different groups. Okay, they're very right wing, and what I mean by right wing, they're very conservative, and they're so way out in left field that they only recognize the authority of the county sheriff. So they actually believe that there's really no form of government higher than the county, and that the only law enforcement officer they have to obey is the county sheriff. Um, and they also do not believe in paying federal taxes as well. And the Posse Comitatus winds up going into the sovereign citizen movement, and some of the Posse Comitatus members also have this um, idea of what's called the Christian identity movement, and they actually believe that the United States has been taken over by the Jews, and they call it the Zionist occupational government, if you will. Okay, they're pretty crazy in their ideas. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the domestic terrorism. We have the sovereign citizen movement, and they grew out of the Posse Comitatus um, group. Uh, they're even more extreme than the Comitatus Posse, and that is that they believe that every citizen is sovereign, and they don't have to obey the law if they don't want to. They pay taxes if they don't want to. One of the problems with that is that you can't have a society that functions like that. Okay, as Aristotle said, man is a social animal. We form communities. So you do have some form of government, and you can't have everyone running around making their own decisions out of their own moral judgments. Right? All right. Then you have radical Islam and leads us to ISIS. And ISIS is a terrorist group that actually controls portions of Iraq and Syria, and they use social media to radicalize people. All right, and what we mean by radicalize, we mean to become radical and to carry out acts of violence that would be considered and have ideas that would not be considered mainstream. So, for instance, you have the Tsarnaev brothers, who are your Boston Marathon bombers in 2012, where they wound up setting off two pressure cooker bombs that killed a bunch of people. And they were both naturalized U.S. citizens, and they were in, um, they're in the United States for 10 years before they committed their terrorism attack. And then you also have the San Bernardino shooters, a husband and wife. The husband was was a U.S. citizen, and the wife was a permanent resident alien. And they were self-radicalized and joined ISIS. And they wound up going into and shooting basically a Christmas party where the husband worked at. So what we're seeing now within domestic terrorism is the use of social media and reaching out to disaffected youth to become members of ISIS and to commit acts of terrorism, because ISIS's goal is to restore the caliphate, which is basically a Muslim kingdom. Okay, next we have international terrorism. And international terrorism can be considered state-sponsored or non-state sponsored. For example, Iran and Syria are both been known to be uh, sponsors of terrorist groups, which means they provide them with material support, weapons, training, money in order to carry out terrorist attacks. Non-state sponsored terrorist groups are represented with the Al Qaeda. That was Osama bin Laden's terrorist group, and Al Qaeda means the base, or ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They are non-state sponsored. They do not receive any sort of funding or training from other countries. They can be regional to global in scale. So Al Qaeda and ISIS is global because they will go ahead and commit attacks across the world. Regional would be, for instance, the terrorist group Hamas and Hezbollah, which operate within Lebanon, and they tend and within Israel, and they are pretty much sponsored by Iran, and they just, like I said, they're regional. They just want to attack Israel because Hamas and Hezbollah are committed to the destruction of Israel. And again, as with all terrorism, they're using is the use of violence to achieve their ideological goals. Okay, I have some videos here for you to watch. Everyone knows about September 11, 2001, where they flew the planes into the World Trade Center. But Osama bin Laden actually also attacked the World Trade Center back in 1993 with a truck bomb. So what we have here are some videos that talk about the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and also September 11th as well, and also President Bush at Ground Zero after the September 11th attacks. So please view those and take some notes on this as well. Thank you. Okay, so what we have here is the U.S. response, the United States response to terrorism and to the September, more specifically to the September 11 attacks right now. When the United States was attacked on September 11th, the NATO countries, which the United States is part of NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was actually a military defense pact that was created to counter Soviet aggression in Europe. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which is the creation of NATO, was invoked, which means an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all of them. So our allies came to the United States aid by saying that we stand with you, and that Article 5 is of the NATO of the Washington Treaty is invoked, which means if the U.S. goes to war in Afghanistan, they're going to be behind us, which they were. When we invaded Afghanistan, we had several of our NATO allies come and join the fight with us. Okay, so with the United States response, we also have the invasion of Afghanistan, because that's actually where Al Qaeda was actually hiding out, in Afghanistan, and the Taliban, which was a group that controlled Afghanistan, which also believed in Al Qaeda's ideologies, was giving them a safe haven. And this is what we call the global war on terror, because President Bush says we're going to go ahead and hunt the terrorists down wherever they may be. Then in 2003, we have the invasion of Iraq and Iraqi freedom. And we can argue whether or not we should have went into Iraq or not, but we went in there in order to try to remove Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal dictator, and which unfortunately also later on leads to the creation of ISIS. We also have, one of our responses was the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, which gave us federal airport screeners. And this is one of the reasons sometimes you'll see longer lines at airports, because you have federal employees screening your luggage and make sure that no one brings any sort of bombs or weapons on board. And we also have a expansion of the Air Marshals program, where that means we have federal air marshals or federal law enforcement officers on international flights. So, okay, then we does try to hijack an airplane, we'll have some federal law enforcement that will be able to go ahead and deal with the situation. Also, obviously, one of our big ones was the killing of Osama bin Laden back in 2012, where we sent in Navy SEALs to kill him, and also attacking ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq. Okay, in response to ISIS, we have been trying to take out ISIS's senior leadership, as well as bomb some of their training facilities as well. Also, we're training the Iraqi army again in order to take the fight to ISIS within Iraq. Okay, we have some more videos here. One of you have the Air Force One documentary video on September 11, 2001. It's a documentary about Air Force One, which is the president's plane, but the first 15 minutes of it is excellent because it talks about uh, what Air Force One did during 9/11. It basically did is serve as a mobile command post for the president. The next is a documentary on the Federal Aviation Administration. Are the air traffic controllers and the Northeastern Air Defense Sector tapes during September 2001. This is a very interesting one to see how we responded um, from a geography point of view and also from an air defense point of view on that day. Next, you have some videos on the U.S. attack on Afghanistan. Then what you'll have is the Bin Laden raid, which is a newscast. That was the animation of the Bin Laden raid. And then you will have here is a President Obama talking about the Bin Laden raid. And then there's a really good little short video clip on the rise of ISIS, and gives you a good general background on the origin of ISIS. So make sure you watch all those and take some good notes on that. Thank you. Okay, so right here now too, this is here is a PowerPoint that came out from FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I added this to the PowerPoint here because I thought this would actually be a pretty good one that gives you kind of like the nuts and bolts about what to do in case of a terrorist attack as well. Um, so go ahead and view this one. Take good corner notes over here, and we will also discuss this in class as well. Okay, right here, this is another a portion of the PowerPoint right here, where this is a PowerPoint from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and this is their response to terrorism and how they deal with it. And so this is a government PowerPoint, and this is actually a really good one, as it kind of gives you uh, more of a better understanding of the types of terrorist attacks and how to deal with a terrorist attack. So take good corner notes over this. We'll discuss this in class next week.